In this video, James Bligh walks you through the consent sequence with the aid of a couple of sequence diagrams.
The reason I've done this as a separate image is because these are things that need to occur prior to consent. Now, some implementations will do some of these things interspersed during the consent process. Things like accessing JWKS files to get keys. Some implementations will do that in real time. Some of them will cache them ahead of time. I have not included these steps interspersed in the consent flow, but these are things that that need to have occurred, or it's assumed to have occurred. So when we're going through the sequence, if you don't see these things, it's because I'm assuming they're being done. So specifically, we're talking about a data holder represented by DH on this sequence diagram has already got data recipient info and status from the register, and has got that recently enough that they can go through the consent process and rely upon it. And they've also got the JOCS data from the ADR, so they can actually validate signatures successfully, etc. Equally on the ADR front, I'm assuming they've already found the ADR's already got the data holder info, and they've already done DCR, and they've already got the data holder JOCS. And I'm assuming the consumer has already signed up to the ADR solution and is going to engage with the ADR. So if you like, these are the prerequisite steps. I put this in a separate diagram because the register is involved, and it just simplifies the consent flow not to have that extra column on there. But the register does get involved, obviously, for these activities. The other thing I would say is these are sequence diagrams created at sequencediagram.org, which takes a fairly standard UML syntax. I have the text file with the UML syntax, and we will make that available on Zendesk in an article, so you can take this and load it up into sequencediagram.org, and then if you wish to change it, add to it, add your own implementation, create your own version, and play with it and take it forward from there. Okay, so we've got three parties here. We've got the consumer or the user, the person actually on the end of a device that wants to share data, and we have the ADR, the accredited data recipient, and we have the DH, the data holder. Okay. So the first phase is setting up the consent request, step one. And so the first thing we do is, and you'll see this repeated all the way through, is the consumer via their device. They're obviously, I haven't represented them as an individual user. When I say consumer here, I'm talking about the consumer's device, browser, mobile app, etc. They establish TLS with the ADR, and they provide consent via consent screens. So this is the process where the ADR is just presenting their stuff to the customer according to the CX guidelines, moderated for their use case, and they go through and they present those screens. Then the ADR, based on what the customer has consented to, will create a request object with the requested scopes and claims and duration, etc. If it's an amended consent, they will include the arrangement ID in the request object, for instance. The ADR will then establish MTLS, so this is back channel, with the data holder, and will call the PAR endpoint that's been advertised by the data holder in discovery. They will then they will pass that part of the request object to the data holder. The data holder will validate the request object signature to ensure that it's come from the ADR as purported to, and then they will cache the object and return a request URI reference to the ADR. And then the ADR will say, I've now got enough, I've staged my consent through PAR. I will now initiate the OIDC hybrid flow by doing a HTTP 302 redirect to the data holder's Authorise endpoint with the request URI reference and all the other information that the Authorise endpoint requires. Things like the redirect URI and the client ID and so on and so forth. We then get to step two, which is Authorise consent. So we've now got the consent, we've asked for it from the customer, the ADR sent it, and you can see now control, represented by the rectangle on the data holder line on the right-hand side. Control is now with the data holder. So the data holder is now in charge of this part of the process. So the consumer is redirected to the data holder and establishes TLS. So this is a front channel engagement, and it's calling the Authorise endpoint as per the 302 redirect it got from the ADR. The data holder then gets that information and authorises the parameters provided on the Authorise call. They go to their cache and they use the redirect URI reference to extract their request object from their par cache, and they validate its contents. That would include looking for an arrangement ID if there's one existing, and so and then they would show the authentication page to the user, to the consumer. The consumer then enters their user ID, the data holder sends the OTP, the consumer gets the OTP and provides it to complete authentication. At this point, the data holder determines if the consumer has multiple profiles or just a single one. And when I say multiple profiles, I am specifically talking about the situation of nominated representative. Yeah, so the consumer could be just a retail customer, in which case there's only one profile, but they could be a retail customer, but also be a nominated representative for 3 different companies, in which case there's now 4 profiles to choose from, or some other combination. That's really up to the data holder, but this is the point where we determine if there's multiple profiles. Also, it's worth noting that that if there is an arrangement ID, so this is amended consent, then you don't have to do, then you don't have multiple profiles, because in an amended consent scenario, it is expected that you're amending a previously established profile with the that was already established at the when that consent was initially established. We then go into an optional step here, which is if there is multiple profiles, the customer selects one. We then present the consent screens to the customer. We can confirm the consent screens. We then go down and present the account list for inclusion. And then we select the accounts to include, and this would include doing all the things required for joint account management service. The reason this is optional is because it could be that the customer hasn't asked for any of the scopes involving accounts. If they've only asked for customer data, then there's no accounts involved anyway. But their customer could only have one account, for instance. They would still, well, actually, in that case, they would probably still need to be asked, do you want to include that account? But there are circumstances, as I said, where scopes are limited, where, you know, asking for an account isn't relevant. We then, we've basically now done the account selection process. We then request final approval. It's basically, are you all good with this? And customer approves. At this point, we then generate the ADR facing authorization code. We store the arrangement details. And if it's an existing arrangement, we update the arrangement in our internal databases to indicate continuity. So this is the amend consent scenario. So that update there would be revoking existing tokens and establishing a new consent in effect. We then do the HTTP 302 back to the ADR and effectively redirect their client browser or web view inside an app or whatever it is to back to the ADR with the authorization code and the accept state. Now, there is obviously another flow that can occur here, and I did include this in the sequence diagram, but it became very complex and messy, which is the reject state. It is entirely possible at this point that the customer says, actually, I'd like to, I'm not interested anymore, I've changed my mind, and they would do a reject here, in which case we would do the 302 back to the ADR with a reject status. And then the ADR would say, I'm very sorry to hear that, and the flow would be over, in effect. Okay, so now we're up to the part where effectively consent is established, but the ADR still can't call a resource endpoint yet. And that's because they don't have an access token, but they do have an authorization code. So this is now up to the point where we exchange tokens. So at this point, I've just got the 302 back to the consumer's device. I redirect that back to the ADR. The ADR receives the authorization code and the accept status and other fields that are included in the response as per the standard. And I then then the ADR will establish MTLS with the data holder, and they will call the token endpoint with the authorization code. The data holder will validate the stored consent and the authorization code. They'll generate an access token and refresh token. They'll bind the access token with the client certificate at some point, which is really important. That's the holder of key step. And then we'll return the access token and the refresh token back to the ADR. At this point, the ADR has both a refresh token and an access token. And the refresh token will have an expiry time dependent on the sharing duration in effect, as well as potentially whether key cycling is implemented by the data holder. But they will have both of those tokens. If you then scroll down to step 4, this is where we actually get data. So this could happen at any point until the refresh token expires. So this could happen in batch, or it could happen interactively, and it could happen for any of the resource endpoints the data holder supports. But effectively, the ADR, when they are ready to get data, they do it back channel, they establish MTLS with the data holder. If they have a valid access token, they don't need to do the next step. If they don't have a valid access token, they would call the token endpoint with their refresh token. The data holder would generate a new one, and if they're doing cycling, they'd create a new refresh token. They would bind the access token with client certificate thumbprint, and then they would return the access token and the refresh token if that's been recreated. Then the ADR would call whichever resource endpoint with the access token. The data holder would look at the access token and check that it's valid and signed properly, and whatever, depending on how they've constructed it, they'll check it, and they'll confirm holder of key, and then they will validate the scopes and claims associated with the consent that the access token represents, and make sure that the call being made is within those scopes and claims, and then they'll return the CDR data. And that's the end of the story, as they say.
You can download the UML for these diagrams from our Consent Sequence Diagrams article on the Support Portal. See the description for links to all references mentioned in this video. And thank you for participating in the Consumer Data Right.